Hello, I'm Stuart Williams. I'm the Publishing Director at The Bodley Head, and I'm really delighted today to welcome Caroline Elkins, who is the author of Legacy of Violence. Welcome, Carrie. You're Professor of History and of African and African American Studies at Harvard, and the founding director of Harvard's Center for African Studies. Thank you so much for being here. Can you briefly start by introducing us to Legacy of Violence?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Stuart, for having me today. Legacy of Violence really starts with the question of, how and why was there such a level of violence in Britain's empire in the 19th and 20th centuries? And really, it's sort of my interest in this stems back from my previous book, Britain's Gulag, which told the story of horrific violence in Kenya in the 1950s. And it really was a book that was looking to establish something as fact, that this happened. But when I got done with that, there were many unanswered questions. And I really was quite interested in how and why not only did we see this unfold in Kenya, but I also recognized in the context of this book that I had dropped into a moment of time. A moment of time that was part of a much bigger story about violence and empire, a story that was about people moving in and out of different locations, bringing with them ideas and tactics that really stretched back into the 19th century, and it was framed around this ideology called liberal imperialism. We might think about it as the white man's burden or the civilizing mission, and really, in my own mind, trying for myself and for my readers to unpack the meanings of that. And so I'm going to take the reader on a journey that moves them through different frames, through taking you right into the heart of some of this cauldron of violence in, say, Cyprus, and then zooming us back out again, back to London, to understand how and why local Londoners are processing this, local Britons, and what is it that they're doing to work and rework this level of violence that they're confronting into a narrative about civilizing reform.
Let's start, if we can, in Kenya and Britain's Gulag, the Mau Mau uprising. That book went on to win the Pulitzer, to be hugely admired, and to be the foundation, really, for a historic court case in Britain brought by survivors. Do you say a little bit about...
Yeah, I'm happy to. Look, I think if we really want to roll back, when this book came out in 2005, when I was a little younger and a little greener, so to speak, I think I naively, I thought that I'd get some pushback for it, and it was... the criticism of the book was enormous. And in part it came out during the period of the Iraq War, and for many Britons it was, you read this book and it was received of, look, you're not unlike what the Americans are up to. There was also the sensitivity around empire. It was one of the first forays into sort of looking at 20th century empire and showing the level of violence. And fortunately, the book also won some awards. But there was a huge cloud that hung over the book, in part because many people said I was wrong, or that these survivors were making it up. And then the court case happened, as you're referring to. In 2009, 5 survivors of the camps filed a claim against Her Majesty's government in the High Court of London. And it was the first time the British government had ever been sued by a former colonized population. And Imperial Reckoning, or Britain's Gulag, which is sitting right up there, was the evidentiary basis for the case, and I was an expert witness. And the case went on for 4 years. And if you don't mind an aside, the attorneys for the case were about a few months into it, and I should have asked this to begin with. I said, well, what are the chances of this case? And they're like, oh, nobody thinks we're going to win. So, but what happened is, sort of, putting that aside, it was the weight of the historical evidence that was brought to bear on this. And in the context of this, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which was the defendant, the named defendant in the case, discovered 300 boxes of previously undisclosed files on Kenya, and sitting next to those boxes were 8,800 files from 36 other colonies, all of which had been packed up and spirited away at the time of decolonization. So the Kenyan files were deeply relevant to the case, and of course the claimants were successful. Eventually, Her Majesty's government came to a settlement, £20 million sterling, an official apology, and a memorial to the victims in Nairobi. But the Imperial History War continued in part because the government released not all, but most of the 8,800 files from the 36 other colonies. And my excavation of those files is in part, makes some of the backbone of the current book, Legacy of Violence.
So both these books are, amongst other things, contain a story of concealment, of official concealment.
Yes, absolutely. I think, it's a great question, Stuart, because I think that if we think about sort of the Orwellian state, right, and doublethink, and the ways in which a state can project one thing and cover up something else, and somehow or another marry these things together so that they actually appear and sound rational, right? Yeah. And as Orwell says, it's both on the subconscious and the conscious level. You have to retrieve facts that you said didn't exist, a year ago. And the British government, as are many governments, but the British government is particularly good at this. Official Secrets Act and the like, they were among the first to do this, at covering things up. And so this story also becomes a story, and I think this is where the case becomes very important. Because in the files for the case were the first documents that we ever got, as historians about the documents documenting Britain's massive document destruction. And so what ended up happening for Legacy of Violence is I had to shift gears a little bit because suddenly the archives and the secrecy of destroying them and concealing them became part of the story.
Yeah. And this is a story you alluded to at the beginning that is happening all over the globe. The empire extends at its zenith to a third of the world's landmass. So just sketch in time and space the sort of the parameters of the story you're telling in Legacy of Violence.
Yeah, I mean, the readers are going to get a geography lesson with this book, right? I think and many of them will already know many of these parts of the world, but we're going to move all over. From the subcontinent of Asia to the Middle East to Africa to the Mediterranean with Cyprus, beginning in the 19th century and moving all the way really up until the present day. But certainly end of empire, ending with Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement. Yeah. The impact of this, and I think one of the things that's very important, and I suggest this in sort of the introduction to the book, and that is, imagine it like a spider's web, where the silk of the web is being spun. And, when you're sort of looking right at a spider's web like this, you can't understand the enormity of it, nor how intricately it's connected. Yeah. And so what this book is seeking to do is to spin this web, to reconstruct this web for the reader, and then allow the readers to step back, to take in the totality of it all, to understand that when the British government and British state explain certain things as a one-off or exceptional, by stepping back and seeing the web, there are no holes in the web. It's intricately connected over time and space, and that's one of the goals of this book.
So there's an awful lot happening, and the geography of it is enormous and intricate and remarkable. But there are ideas that link these times and places, aren't there? What you're doing is tracing continuities and how one moment of emergency or crisis is used again and is extended and made, how the sort of the temporary is made permanent.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think how do we understand the connections between, we can rattle them off, right? The Indian Mutiny in 1857, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, then we have, and I can keep going, the Irish, Ireland in the 20s, Amritsar in 1919, we can keep going, right, in Palestine, etc., into the post-World War II period, where we go back to Palestine, and then Kenya, and Cyprus, and Malaya. And, oftentimes these different insurgencies and wars are kind of studied in a silo. And when they are connected, they're connected often by military historians. And that's some of our story. Military historians out there are going to like this book, or not, as the case may be, insofar as what you're going to have to confront in terms of the violence. But the point that I make in this is that ideology is crucial, and that nobody, a policeman, a soldier, a district colonial officer, a settler, lived in an ideological vacuum. And this concept of liberal imperialism, this idea, as I said, of how does one spread the ideals, the 19th century ideals of a liberal state, beyond Britain's shores. And as you know, in the 19th century, Britain was quite reformist. It was slowly and haltingly, but the franchises extended. But the moment liberalism hits different shores with brown and black individuals, subjects, it becomes problematic. Will they ever be British? Will they be like us? And the idea, of course, was yes, eventually, through developmentalism, through paternalism, they will eventually be British. But of course, remember, within this civilizing mission, it's all about reform and it's also about coercion. And that's a huge part of our story. And I think this is where this book is different than others, insofar as oftentimes it's kind of a balance sheet of accounting. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? But when we ask the how and why question, then we begin to understand how the legacies endured. They endured not just there, but here. And if you think about the difference, say, between the British Empire with the civilizing mission and the Nazi Empire, very different. Oftentimes we like to align these today, particularly when we're talking about, current contemporary politics. We'll say, oh, that's fascist. Well, what's so pernicious about liberalism is that it is reformist. They can point to the investigatory committee. They can point to improvements in education. They can point to improvements in medicine. Those are all very real.
Yeah.
And if we discount them, then we're discrediting historical facts. And yet at the same time, this state was this colonial leviathan, right? This that had the complete control over state coercion and violence, was dreadfully brutal.
That's it. And I just want to zero in on those two ideas, just in words absolutely of one syllable. Liberal imperialism. What are we talking about there? And as you're saying, that this is a record, a history of literal violence that is enacted on people, on bodies. It is not. It is not an ideological violence. What you're unpacking here happened to people. Can we just
absolutely
dig into those?
This book is about actual violence to bodies, to minds, but to bodies in particular. Liberal imperialism was about reform and coercion. And where they are two sides of the same coin is where there's the belief that, just like with childlike creatures, and that's how the colonial subjects were described, that by whipping them, by punishing them, they would help them develop and grow up, like a child.
Yeah.
And there's a lexicon for this, right? It starts with the civilizing mission, then we talk about trusteeship. World War II, masterful. Getting back to the reformist state, trusteeship is out of fashion. Partnership. Partnership becomes out of fashion. It's replaced with the idea of liberal imperialism in terms of the violence. There was a word for that too. The moral effect of violence. When that's no longer fashionable, it's called rehabilitation in hearts and minds.
And you say, you write at one point that all empires are violent, but there are many differences between the British Empire and others. Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, I think I think that's an important question, Stuart, because I think that folks may read this book and say, "Hey, what about the other places?" I'm not saying that the other places weren't pernicious. What I'm saying, this book is about legacy of violence. The British Empire was and continues to be metonymic with empire and with imperial success. And I'm seeking to challenge both myself as the writer and you as the reader to interrogate that. And to understand when an empire encompasses a third of the world's landmass and 700 million colonial subjects, that the nature of that empire is going to have long-standing effects. And if we want to ask ourselves, how is it and why is it that we're living in the world today that we're living in, we must understand the legacy of the British Empire.
Yeah. There's an amazing phrase that comes early on. Good government in empire was liberalism's fever dream. Do you want to just unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes, I think, look, there are many sort of phrases, rule of law, good governance, which 19th century towering philosopher, John Stuart Mill, and others, and that these carry forward. And good governance was sort of the watchword. We're bringing good government. The Indians, they were despotic. The Africans, they were savage. But in bringing good governance to these distant shores with brown and black colonial subjects, everything was turned upside down. And all of the ideas about reform and coercion become almost inverted and in some ways fused. And they spend much of the time, and I mean by they, I mean everybody, from frontline administrators and soldiers to members of parliament to the British public to those who are critiquing empire, and there are many at the time. And it's like, it just reminded me of a fever dream. Just, and those dreams you wake up and you're disoriented and you're sweating and you can't make sense of things. And then suddenly it breaks.
Yeah.
And really sometimes fever dreams then come back again. And anyway, that was the point of that phrase.
Talking of resonant phrases, lawful lawlessness is one that it probably underpins so much of what you're writing about, that time and again, in this place, in another place, 50 years hence, that the legitimization, the way that lawlessness is codified, that's a recurring theme.
Absolutely. Look, I think if there's one takeaway from the justification of the British Empire, it's that it was bringing the rule of law to backward and uncivilized populations.
Yeah.
And when we think about today, whether it was the Mau Mau court case or in general, when people analyze the British Empire, they will say that wasn't an atrocity; it was law. It was legal. Now, if you step back and think about that, if you create laws that render something legal that was previously illegal in order to subjugate a large population, what do you make of that? And so I called it legalized lawlessness.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. So there are many in the book that we highlight, but if we look at, say, for example, easy one for folks who they made, the Amritsar Massacre, 1919. General Dyer and his troops go in and open fire in a small courtyard and kill hundreds of people, injure others, and then they take off to the border of Afghanistan. The local colonial official declares a state of emergency, declares martial law, and then backdates it.
Right.
So all of Dyer's actions would therefore be
legal. Yeah.
There are other times where Malaya, where they need to detain large numbers of the population, and there are no laws on the books for that. Because it's illegal to detain Her Majesty's subjects on what they might do. So what do? You create an emergency regulation, you make it legal, and then you can round them all up. And this happens, and the point is, Stuart, and that is, this is a recurring process that happens over and over and over again. And I think it's something that should give us serious pause when we think about not only the rule of law, but the legacy of legalized lawlessness. When we point to, and this is not meant as sort of an apologist framing, but when we point to countries in the global south today that were part of the former British Empire that are unquestionably autocratic states, the democracies are failing, there are reasons for that. There are reasons for that. And I think we need to look at constitutions, we need to look at processes that were left behind, like legalized lawlessness, to understand how and why the British Empire shaped the world that it is today.
Because that idea of a legal vacuum or of lawlessness is something that we do not associate with Britain, with democracies. It is, lots of historians might characterize that as a defining characteristic of fascist states. That at various points in history, that has been an enabling mechanism. So that is a reckoning for us, the reader, with what Britain has been at various points.
Yes, and I think in that sense it is true of, and this gets back to sort of opening our aperture, that it's a legacy of liberal states in general, right? And I think sometimes people will accuse me, why are you picking on Britain so much? And it's not that at all. I find it, for me, intellectually, for all the reasons that we've already discussed, the size, the impact, and the sheer number of extreme moments of violence with states of emergency and martial law. And it provides a window for us, not just into Britain, but into other democracies of the world, that embedded in those democratic structures are abilities to suspend law, to create new laws. And all of that is legal. And so, and again, it's what makes charges of, whether it's violence or institutionalized racism, whatever the case may be, hard to stick.
Yeah. Carrie, tell us a bit about the immense research journey that you've been on, the underpinning of this book.
Yeah, it was pretty massive. It's kind of like, where's Waldo on the map? It was 14 different research sites spread all over the world. And look, I'm a firm believer that you must go to the areas that you're writing about, that you have to interrogate those local archives, particularly given the level of document destruction, and that you, where possible, I'm a big fan of interviews. I integrate a lot of my historical method is integrating archival and oral sources. On a fun note, at that point, my children were young. They're now off in college. I took the decision to take them everywhere with me, so it made me take a few breaks in the action. But yeah, so they've been jungle trekking in Malaya, eating snails in Cyprus, excavating archives in Singapore, which I made them do, not such a hit. But I do think, importantly, there's nothing like being a parent where you also see some of these areas of the world through a child's eyes. And I have to say, it allows one to humanize certain things or see it in a different way. And I think in that sense, this was a deep intellectual journey, but it was also one where one has to be very self-aware about the emotional impact that this is having on you and how one can both distance yourself from that and not be afraid to embrace it at the same time.
And when the readers made that journey, and it is a rich, long, sometimes distressing journey in this book. This is simplifying, but what do you hope we might take from it? How might we emerge from it with our understanding of Britain and the world changed?
I do believe, Stuart, that historians, and this book has something to offer the readers about how we came to be who we are today in the world in which we're living, which is so fraught in so many ways. And I'm a firm believer of understanding the roots of that in order to reform, in order to reimagine something different going forward, in order to understand why hundreds of millions of people who have been told, you'll be like us, but not yet. They've been told not yet for 200 years. When we think about how and why we have legalized lawlessness proliferating today. So to me, this book is both, it's a sobering book. I certainly won't sugarcoat it in that way. But I also want it to be one that provides a compass for the readers to think about and imagine a different and new tomorrow.
Fantastic. You described the huge research undertaking, many places. As an academic, as a researcher, that's the bedrock of this. There's a moment it comes to write the book. Put us in your writer's room where you were describing earlier. You were gathering everything in lockdown.
So it was. I was finishing up the last major push of the book, and lockdown was about to start, and we had this tiny little house outside of Boston, and we went there, and I had a feeling it was going to be a month or two, and we loaded up the van, and I mean, I could fill this room tenfold with the books and the research, and also I have several hard drives and the rest of it, and so I pretty much spent 18 months, which to me was absolute bliss, surrounded by my books and research. Like, you could smell, the decaying smell of I like that. Like, just, you can smell it. Like, it's there, it's with you. And it was all in my bedroom, so I would wake up to it. And then I had bought this I splurged a little bit on this Scandinavian chair because I have a terrible back, and I would sit in it for 18 hours a day, 16 hours a day, writing. Just, and it was, to me, lockdown was, and look, it was, I don't want to minimize the tragedy in so many ways, Stuart, but for me personally, the ability to not have the register broken, to just immerse myself in it. It was a very difficult book to read, and in part because I wanted my readers to have a seamless narrative, to be able to read this and be gripped by the narrative, to feel emotion about the narrative, so it wasn't just about, and importantly for an historian, you got to get the facts right. You have to, your documentation has to be airtight. But I wanted the reader to come on a journey in this book. And to do that, you have to be very careful to detail, and also be thinking about how one will receive this book as a reader who may not have any familiarity. Anyway, it was an interesting lockdown. As I said, whenever somebody would even come in a room and make a cup of tea, I'd be, you're breaking, it's like nails on the chalkboard. Breaking spell. And at the same time, at this point, it's also a little scary now, I have to admit, because for so long I lived with this book myself. It was all up here in my head on the hard drive, and it's a little scary letting it go. And at the same time, I'm excited. I want to engage readers with this. I want to hear what they have to say about it, and to learn from them, because I think even for those who have read drafts of the manuscript, everybody has a different takeaway. The book will move you, the reader, in different frames, from, as we said, tiny locations to big picture ideas, back and forth, and then connect these together. And so I'm excited to hear what folks have to say about it.
We're really excited about it. We're very glad to have had Carrie here today to tell us about it. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you.